Shalom, everyone, and welcome to the channel. If you enjoy the content that you see today, leave a like down below, and please consider subscribing to the channel and become part of our growing community. With all that out of the way, enjoy the video. Shalom.
Does the Sabbath day of rest, or Shabbat, still apply to believers today? Was it replaced by Sunday, or the first day of the week? Or could it be that this day points to something more than what we think? Today, my guest, David Wilber, will touch on these questions and more as we discuss the importance of Shabbat. Join me as we explore this topic together. David Wilber, shalom, brother.
Hey, Shalom. Great to be with you.
Thanks for coming on at the almost last minute, having some technical difficulties there, but I really appreciate your time on the podcast. Reached out to you a couple of weeks ago or about a week ago, and I know you have a busy schedule, so thanks for coming on.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. I love talking about this topic, so it's great to be with you, and I'm looking forward to diving in.
David Wilber, author, Bible teacher, CEO of Pronomian Publishing. We spoke about different things that I had a lot of things on my mind that I kind of wanted to talk about. The list goes on, but one in particular, specifically because I know that you've written articles, you have a book that you've written as well, which I definitely want my viewers to, at the end of this podcast, to be able to get that. And just recently, in fact, I was watching it today as well, just to kind of review. You had a debate with R.L. Solberg. I guess it was about a year ago, and there were so many good topics on there that I get these questions quite a bit from believers day in and day out. And I thought, who better to have on a podcast and talk about these things than somebody, in my eyes, that's an expert in it. So again, welcome. And if you want to just take a few minutes and introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, my name's David, as you mentioned. I have been keeping the Sabbath for almost 2 decades now, I think. But yeah, I've been interested in the topic of Torah observance and a messianic theology for many years. And as you mentioned, I have written a few books. I wrote one book on the Sabbath called Remember the Sabbath, What the New Testament Says About Sabbath Observance for Christians. My most recent book was actually a study on Matthew 5:17 through 20. Um, just an exegesis of those four verses and promoting what I like to call a pronomian perspective. Pronomian, it's just the opposite of antinomian. It means pro-law. And so I presented that perspective, and that book is called How Jesus Fulfilled the Law. So, but yeah, I love this topic, and yeah, like I said, I'm excited to dive in.
I think the first place to start is very basically, what is Shabbat? What is Sabbath?
Yeah, so the Sabbath is it is a day, all right. There's a lot of people that might want to try to redefine it, and they want to say, oh well, Sabbath Jesus is now my Sabbath, or whatever they want to say. But the Sabbath, by definition, is a day. It is a day that God set apart in creation. When it shows up in the second chapter of Genesis, and really those chapter divisions are arbitrary. I mean, those were put there much later by translators, but really it's part of the creation account in Genesis. You have the creation account that's what starts our Bible, right? The account of God creating the heavens and the earth, and that culminates in the seventh day. And the seventh day, he ceased from his work of creation, and the Bible says that he sanctified that day. So from the very beginning of creation, the Sabbath day, which is the seventh day of the week on our calendar, that would be Friday night to Saturday night, because biblical days begin at night. And it's a day that God has sanctified from the very beginning of creation, and there is nothing in the Bible that I've been able to find that shows that he unsanctified that day, or that he took away the sanctification of it. It is still a holy day. It is something that the apostles observed. It is something that our Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, that he observed. And it's something that I think is also meaningful for us today to do. It's one of the Ten Commandments. And just like the other nine commandments, I think this is something that God expects us to uphold in our lives as believers.
If you're like me, in a lot of my audience, when we grew up in church, pretty much everybody kept Sunday as a rest day, and I
Hmm.
don't think anybody's a stranger to that. Why do you think, or what are your thoughts on why a lot of believers reject the Sabbath or Shabbat and stick to the Sunday day of rest?
The short answer to your question is church tradition. So that's essentially the reason why most of Christianity observes Sunday as a day of religious services, and why the Sabbath is neglected. Now, this is a very interesting topic when you get into church history. Um, Number one, Sunday church services, or treating Sunday as a special day for church services, that goes back very early. So Christians were doing that um, at least as early as the mid second century.
Right,
It could go back a little bit earlier than that. But and that day, the Sunday, was observed because it was widely believed to have been the day that Yeshua rose from the dead. And so eventually Christians started referring to Sunday as the Lord's Day. And so there is a very early tradition for treating Sunday as a special day for religious services. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with going to church on Sunday or any day for that matter.
right,
But there's no commandment concerning it. There is a commandment in Scripture concerning the seventh day, and treating the seventh day as a holy day of rest. And so when you get into church history, what you find is that, well, number one, starting with the Bible, we know that in the Old Testament, God expected his followers to keep the seventh day holy. And in the New Testament, there is really no indication that that expectation has changed. There are a couple of passages which I'm sure we could talk about, like Colossians 2 and Romans 14, and Hebrews 4, that are sometimes
yes,
given to suggest that something has changed. I read those passages differently. But when you look just at the book of Acts, when you look at the Gospels, Yeshua's ministry, the assumption is that the Sabbath has not changed, that it's still something that God wants his people to do. And his people did observe the Sabbath. We see this throughout the Gospels, throughout the book of Acts. We see that in the book of Acts, we see the apostles continuing to rest on the seventh day. When you get outside of the Bible, when you start going a little bit later in Christian history, like the second century on, um, it becomes a little bit more complex. So we know that Christians universally did not start observing Sunday in replacement of the Sabbath.
right,
Um, but basically, according to the historical evidence, what we find is that actually most Christians, at least outside of Alexandria and Rome, continued to observe both days. So we have two 5th century historians, one named Socrates Scholasticus, another one named Sozomen, and they're writing in the 5th century. And both of them testify that almost the entire Christian world outside of Alexandria and Rome observed both the Sabbath as a day of rest and what they call the Lord's Day, Sunday, for religious services. that most Christians observed both those days.
Right.
And so that's as late as the 5th century AD. So right there, that tells us that in the minds of at least Christians in as late as the 5th century, in their minds, Sunday was not considered a replacement of the Sabbath. Many Christians kept both days, and at the very least, Sunday was not regarded as the Christian Sabbath. That was not considered a day of rest. It was a separate religious day. And so the idea that Sunday is the quote unquote Christian Sabbath, or that it has replaced the Sabbath, that notion did not really develop until much later in history. Um, it started with a decree that Constantine made. Constantine made a decree. I forget the exact year, but it was in the 4th century. He decreed that Sunday pretty much ought to be treated as a day of rest.
Yes.
Okay. And that is what opened the door. Now, Christians were already, by this time, treating Sunday as a special religious day. They did not consider it a day of rest. But when Constantine made that decree, that kind of opened the door for the blurring of the lines, so to speak, between Sabbath and Sunday. And that allowed for later ecclesiastical authorities to start, making rulings that you should rest on Sunday and not on Saturday.
That's
We
kind
see
of where it
that.
started all to snowball from there, right?
Right, right. So you see that in like the Council of Laodicea, a couple decades after this decree from Constantine, and so it was really that decree that opened the floodgates for that. It opened the snowball effect, so to speak. And later on in history, that just sort of became the idea that Sunday replaced the Sabbath as the day of rest. But yeah, as late as the 5th century, Christians did not think that. They distinguished them, and many Christians continued to do both. In Alexandria and Rome, I know I'm kind of rambling here,
No,
perhaps, but
no, it's very good information.
okay. But yeah, in Alexandria and Rome, Christians did start abandoning the Sabbath earlier on and observing exclusively Sunday. And my theory is that that had to do with the hostilities between the Roman Empire and the Jewish people. And so you had the hostilities between the government and the Jews were seemed to have been more severe in Alexandria and Rome, and so that is why you see a greater desire among Christians in those regions to want to disassociate with Judaism and to disassociate from things that they considered to be, Jewish ways of living,
Exactly.
which would be considered, the Sabbath. And so that happened earlier on in those regions. But as I said, that sentiment was not universal. It was not immediate. Eventually most Christians did abandon the Sabbath, but that was a much later development, and it was something that happened gradually over time. And in my opinion, not because of what the New Testament teaches, but because of political pressure and a desire for Christians to want to sort of disassociate from Judaism, is kind of what led to that.
You make a good point because, and I want to keep it within the scope of Sabbath keeping, but and correct me if I'm wrong. It really wasn't only Sabbath. It was the days that they would celebrate, which is the
Mhm.
Christmas or any of the different pagan holidays that they kind of melted in with that culture because of the butting heads or the disagreements, or as you mentioned, I think you said Constantine had made this ruling, and in order to consolidate his kingdom, wanted to get a lot of the people to come and start doing his traditions versus the Judaism.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated. There definitely was some melding together of culture, and I think that the motivation to sort of abandon a lot of the holy days within Torah and other things, such as kosher, for example,
Hmm.
that biblically eating only biblically clean animals, those were regarded as quote unquote Jewish. Like for whatever reason, those ritual commandments of the Torah were regarded as Jewish, and they were markers of Jewish identity. And so Christians, because of political pressure from Rome, they many of them where that persecution was going on, where that hostility was going on between Rome and the Jews, like there was a motivation to want to not identify as part of Judaism, or to not be seen as Jewish, quote unquote. And so that's what it led to a lot of the predominantly Gentile Christians of that period to stop observing those days, particularly in Rome and Alexandria. So I think that's a, a lot of what it had to do with. Constantine's role, I think, is sometimes overemphasized or overstated. He really, he just didn't want any problems. Like he just kind of validated, I think, a lot of what Christians were already doing. And so we do know that very early on, Christians were already meeting on Sunday. That was a very early and widespread tradition. And so he just kind of came along and put his stamp on that. And so I don't really I mean he certainly had some anti-Semitic sentiments himself.
Certainly.
Yeah, I mean we see that in the Council of Nicaea with Passover, right? And the choosing of the day of Passover, he had some anti-Semitic remarks concerning that. Um, in a letter that was sent. But yeah, he I think that's mainly what it had to come down to, or what it came down to is a desire for many Christians within those areas to disassociate from anything that was considered Jewish.
Right. And you mentioned something earlier too, and I remember you speaking about this in your debate with Solberg, where he can continuously mention that Sabbath was not mentioned as something that we had to keep in the New Testament. And I almost wanted to scream through the through the video. I almost wanted to say that, for my estimation, the New Testament, or the Brit Hadashah, is not so much supposed that its purpose, in other words, is not supposed to retell every single commandment. That's not its purpose. I mean, you have Deuteronomy, which is the retelling of the commandments, which went over everything before they go into the land. So, and
Right.
I hear that argument not only in the debate, but with others that we're trying to speak to about this, that the New Testament, really its purpose and its function is not really to retell every single law, but merely to, what is it, Jeremiah 31 through 33, I believe, Ezekiel 36, where it's a
Uh-huh.
fulfillment of the renewed covenant. Is that something you would subscribe to?
Yeah, I think my question would be, and it's been a while since I've reviewed that debate, but my question for someone like Solberg would be, why does God have to repeat himself? Like
Exactly. Yes.
why do we make that assumption that if he does not repeat himself, it isn't valid anymore? How does
Right.
that follow? Like for example, let's stay with the Old Testament. Let's say Jeremiah. He is you know there's a command in the Torah against cross-dressing, and I don't think that is repeated anywhere. So, would it be reasonable for Jeremiah to say, well, God has repeated the Sabbath commandment several times through the other prophets and to Moses and others? The Sabbath commandment is repeated, but he hasn't repeated the command against cross-dressing since Moses. So, I guess that commandment doesn't apply anymore.
Apparently not.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, yeah, right. Uh, but yeah, and maybe maybe that's a poor example because there are a lot of people that disregard that commandment these days. But it wouldn't be reasonable for Jeremiah to say that. Like God doesn't have to repeat himself. So let's just fast forward then to the New Testament, and it's not reasonable for someone in the time of Jesus or Paul or whoever to say, well, God hasn't repeated the Sabbath commandment, so therefore it doesn't apply. It just seems like it's a faulty assumption. that God has to repeat something in order for it to be valid. And I think we can pick any example from the New Testament. I mean, the command against practicing necromancy, that is not repeated in the New Testament that I'm aware of. The commandment against kidnapping, I don't think that is explicitly repeated in the New Testament. So, so I think I just don't think it's a very good argument. But also I would say that even though the commandment, the explicit commandment, keep the Sabbath holy, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, even though that is not explicitly repeated in the New Testament, it is certainly reaffirmed. It is certainly, reinforced. We
Yes.
see this, for example, in Matthew 5:17 through 20, where Yeshua says that he did not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but he came to fulfill them. And he said to do and teach even the least of the commandments, referring to the law and prophets. So Sabbath is certainly one of those commandments that Yeshua is referring to there. We see it in Mark 2, right, where he says the Sabbath is made for man. The Sabbath was created in the beginning for man.
Yes.
So Yeshua reemphasizes the purpose of the Sabbath, that it was made to bless mankind. Did that blessing go away? Did the Sabbath stop serving that purpose? No. And yeah, so I think that while it isn't, while the commandment is not explicitly restated, it is reinforced, it is reaffirmed in various ways. Even just looking at the way that Yeshua and the apostles lived, they did not live as if they believed the Sabbath no longer applied.
Right.
They continued to keep the Sabbath throughout the book of Acts. And that is simply not what we would expect if R.L. Solberg's position is correct, that the Sabbath no longer applies. I think that there's the evidence is stacked against that assumption. It's just, there's just really no support for that assumption. There's no basis for it to begin with. Um, why something has to be repeated. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Anyway,
that and I think
I'm going on and on, but
no, I think no, that's perfect, and I think that argument, and not only just the Sabbath, but in any type of commandments that we keep, stating that if it's not found in the New Testament, therefore it doesn't apply. I guess in my mind, the biggest argument against that is that that's not its purpose. The New Testament is that the function of it is not for the retelling of everything. So you nailed it. So two,
yeah, and I think that's a really good point, because what a lot of people miss, especially when it comes to Paul's letters, is that they're situational.
mhm,
They're written to particular communities, to answer very specific, or to respond to very specific issues that we don't have the context for. Like
mhm,
a lot of times we have to really put in a lot of effort to understand what Paul is even talking about.
mhm,
And we still can't be 100% certain. But his letters are situational. They are not a systematic theology. Really, nothing in the Hebrews is probably the closest to a systematic theology, so to speak, in the New Testament. But yeah, everything else is situational. It's addressing specific communities, addressing specific issues. Like you said, the purpose of the New Testament is not to give us some comprehensive law code.
right.
I think that's a great point.
Two last questions that I wanted to ask David is, and they deal with the functionality and the practicality of keeping the Sabbath.
Mhm.
The first question is going to be in regards to future events, and the second question would be in regards to us today practically. So, and you mentioned Hebrews, specifically 4, I think you said, and I think it
Mhm.
even begins in the end of chapter 3 and goes into 4, where he's speaking about, the writer's speaking about the incident that when they were in the wilderness, and everything that was coming upon them, that some fell away, and he's admonishing them to keep the faith, to make it into the promised land. And then all of a sudden, the next verse, just like that, he brings Sabbath, just
Mhm.
as God worked for 6 days and rested on the Sabbath, almost as if he's tying the Sabbath with the land promise or the rest. Or you
Mhm.
could even say, Yeshua, because he is our rest, which you mentioned it in Mark 2 and Matthew
Mhm.
12:8. It speaks about that. So would you say that Sabbath points to a some type of a future event in that maybe would play in its function for us to be keeping it today?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's what Hebrews 4 is saying. I think it's primarily talking about the age to come there,
Mhm.
the ultimate rest that we will enjoy in the age to come. And sometimes people will point to that, and they will say, well, now that we have now that we know what the Sabbath points to, or the Sabbath points to that ultimate rest that we have, that we're able to enjoy because of what Christ accomplished for us. They will say that this means that the literal Sabbath day does not need to be kept anymore.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's an argument that some might
Hmm.
put forward. But I don't think that really works, for the same reason that we have other symbols like baptism. Baptism points to our new life in Christ. Romans 6 says, you've been baptized in his death, and you rise again. And so baptism is a symbol. It points to the new life that we are able to enjoy because of what Christ did for us. But nobody believes that we no longer have to baptize new believers because of that. Now that we understand that greater truth behind baptism, nobody believes that now we shouldn't baptize new believers. So I think similarly, yes, the Sabbath does point beyond itself. It does point forward to the ultimate rest that we're able to enjoy in the Messiah. But we still have the literal day of rest, and the literal day of rest is like a foretaste of that. It's a
Exactly.
taste. Yeah, it's a taste of that ultimate rest. And yeah, why wouldn't we want to enjoy that? The age to come is still to come. It's still in the future. And so the Sabbath day gives us an opportunity to have a taste of that right now in the present. It's like, I like to talk about it in the sense of like time travel, right? The Sabbath is kind of like a time machine, because you are bringing the future age to come into your present reality.
Hmm.
You are enjoying that rest. You're getting a taste of that wonderful rest that we're going to enjoy, and you're able to bring that into your present reality every seventh day. And that's what I think the purpose of the Sabbath is. It's to be a taste of that ultimate reality that we will enjoy. And yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing. And Yeah, it's a taste or a glimpse of the complete rest yet to come.
It's almost as if it's like a rehearsal of what's going to be happening in the future. And so every day, every time that you
Mhm.
keep it, you're just preparing for that day to come.
Right.
My last question would be, how does this practically apply to you today? Like, what would you tell people when they keep the Sabbath? Not only because it's a commandment
Mhm. Mhm.
from Abba, but also when you do keep it, how is it a blessing to you and your family, David?
Oh gosh, we look forward to Sabbath all week.
Yes.
Yeah, we thankfully, my wife and I, we were both messianics before we got married, and so we got to start our marriage off right off the bat, observing Sabbath together, as a married couple, and we also are bringing up our children in this. And so, the Sabbath and the festivals, that is all our kids have ever known. We never celebrated Christmas or anything, before. So yeah, that it's all they've ever known, and yeah, they look forward to the Sabbath. They look forward to the festivals, and we go all out. Like the Sabbath is a big deal in the Wilber house. We prepare for it. We have special blessings and traditions that we do, and we just do what we can to sanctify the day, like we're told to do, right? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and so we sanctify that day. We it is part of our pattern of life, that okay, the Sabbath day, that is something that we have to prepare for. It's something that is set apart, and we get to enter into that. And so we do a lot of special traditions. We don't work. My kids know I'm a little bit of a workaholic, and so my kids know that Sabbath, Daddy is forced not to work. He is commanded not to work, and so that is something that they get to look forward to, and they know they're like, well, even if Bat Daddy's extra busy this week, we know that he has to spend time with us on Sabbath. That that is a good expectation.
Yes.
That is something that they expect, and they should expect. And so yeah, it's a day that we spend together as a family. We go to church, of course. We go to a Messianic congregation locally. And so that's a major part of our lives is being able to worship with other believers on the Sabbath, and join others in sanctifying the day. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we do. It is definitely a huge impact on our lives. But yeah, I've been doing it so long that I could not even I don't even know how I would be able to function going back.
Yeah.
It's just so ingrained in my pattern and my rhythm of living. I couldn't even go back, and I wouldn't want to go back because I need rest.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
I think
yeah,
I tell people that all the time is that I can't imagine my life being not having Shabbat, not having that day of rest, not only just to rest my body, but just to reflect on our week and do study our Torah portion, or you're spending time with family. There's so many practical benefits that you get, and it just seems like God had that in mind. I'm not only going to teach my kids to know when I'm going to be coming back sometime in the future and how it relates to the land rest, but also it's going to be a blessing to them also as
yeah,
well. So, I mean, I couldn't imagine my life without Sabbath. But
yeah.
well, thank you so much for your time, David. If you want to give the folks some information about yourself, how can they get in touch with you, get your books, read your articles?
Yeah, well, it was an honor to be on here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and I'm pretty easy to find. Yeah, my name's David Wilber, and that's, by the way, Wilber, not UR. I'm not related to Paul Wilber. I get asked that
My
all the
my
time.
my father asked me that, by the way.
Yeah, I get asked that all the time. But yeah, it's Wilber, and you could go to davidwilber.com, and pretty much everything you would want to find is there. So all of my books are on my website, all my social media. Would love to connect with you on social media, and you can also subscribe to my newsletter there for free, and you can stay connected that way.
Thank you, David, so much, and shalom, and hopefully we can do this again.
Yeah, I would love to. Yeah, shalom. Thank you for having me.
Shalom, brother.